like sort of a very tangible deadline. I mean, if the debt ceiling isn't raised by around the summer, then the country will default on its loans and it'll ruin its credit rating, which has massive implications for, stock markets, bonds, things like that. And so you're right, this is something that has to happen.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle. I'm joined today by White House reporter Naomi. The president has been leaving the White House a little bit to go meet with members of Congress, Democrats in the House and the Senate. He's had a lunch session with them. He did a public speech for the House Democrats. What kind of things might they be talking about?
So we've sort of seen the president go on a little pep talk series, talking with congressional Democrats. As you mentioned, he spoke with House Democrats at their caucus, their conference, where they talk about the issues that they want to sort of go to the fore in the next couple of years. The speech that he delivered was sort of one that was like quite optimistic and cheerful, saying that we have this great record, we just have to keep selling it and implementing it. And then we also saw a couple of bones that he threw, sort of making fun, dinging Marjorie Taylor Greene, the Georgia Republican, and I think sort of just trying to bring everyone together as we sort of prepare for this debt ceiling fight. On the Senate side, I mean, we don't know as much about what went down in that meeting because it was a private closed-door luncheon, but
Sure.
Of course senators like to talk. We sort of heard that he was sort of talking about the DC crime resolution and things like that, but he also, I think it's a sort of a critical moment for Senate Democrats as their majority is a little bit under threat, where they've had John Fetterman, the Democrat from Pennsylvania, sort of check himself in to Walter Reed to deal with clinical depression. Then we're also seeing a lot of Democrats turn to 2024 with Dianne Feinstein from California announcing her retirement, and John Tester announcing that he's going to run for re-election in Montana. So it's sort of like this critical moment where he's kind of running a kumbaya moment for the party before sort of potentially a very bruising election next year.
Right, and so they really were happy after the midterm elections because they picked up a seat in the Senate even as they lost the House. But it hasn't really necessarily worked out that way. They thought Kamala Harris could be free to roam about the country and not be stuck in the Senate. Now she's still back there breaking ties, even though they theoretically have 51 votes. So the Biden administration has a little bit of work cut out for themselves there. But the debt ceiling is really, I think, the big area where they're going to have to fight House Republicans, or where they're planning to fight House Republicans. And Biden has promised he's going to share his fiscal vision with the budget that's coming out next week. What are some of the sort of battle lines that are being drawn here?
You're exactly right. I think we're going to see this
Thank
sort of...
you.
You're welcome. We're sort of going to see this debt ceiling negotiations or posturing kind of enter a new phase with this release of this budget framework. I think, Biden is very cognizant of the fact that, or he repeats a lot that, show me your budget and I'll show you your values. At the same time, it's sort of like this opening position statement where when Republicans are looking to find concessions with Democrats in terms of spending, like we're going to see what their map going forward is, and it's a way to sort of starting the bargaining. I think what we're going to see is some things that I'm going to be looking for is obviously the top lines on defense spending, particularly with the Ukraine war, but also his plan for Social Security. He's sort of spoken about how he's been pressed a lot about what his plan is to keep the program viable if he doesn't want to cut it. And they've sort of said, we're going to not get ahead of this budget. You'll see it all in this document, and so we'll be looking at that. And that comes as, and we've spoken about this plenty of times before, in terms of how Biden is trying to really push back on this Republican idea that Social Security and Medicare could be on the chopping block when it comes to trying to find getting down the deficit and things like that. Now Republicans have become very touchy about this. Senator Rick Scott from Florida, who originally sort of floated this idea, has been very clear that this is not what he intended, and we're just sort of seeing those battle lines being drawn. But we also saw them sort of expanded. Biden has been sort of focused on Social Security and Medicare, but then he sort of expanded it this week to Obamacare and Medicaid. And it was kind of interesting to see him choose to launch this new attack in Virginia Beach, which is the home district of Republican Jen Kiggans, who flipped the seat last year. But what's really interesting is that she's a former Navy pilot, but then also a former geriatric adult nurse practitioner. So to try and pitch this idea that Republicans are being soft on healthcare was sort of a little bit tone deaf in terms of that rollout. So some Republicans are worried about that attack, but I think that they'll also find holes in it moving forward.
You know, all of us geriatric adults are a little worried about that kind of stuff. But you know, Biden's budget's not going to pass because Republicans control the House. You know, a lot of things Republicans want to do aren't going to become law because Biden won't sign it into law. He'll veto the Republican spending bills if they don't fall in line with what he wants. So a lot of it is about 2024. But the debt ceiling, something has to happen there one way or the other. That's not necessarily a political deadline, is it?
Well, it is like sort of a very tangible deadline. I mean, if the debt ceiling isn't raised by around the summer, then the country will default on its loans and it'll ruin its credit rating, which has massive implications for, you know, stock markets, bonds, things like that. And so you're right, this is this is something that has to happen. And I think, I mean, we're sort of seeing, again, as I said, not so much negotiations, because that's a word that the White House doesn't like. It wants to say that, you know, this is a matter of so much importance that we shouldn't negotiate on it. And so I think that we'll just sort of see as it tends to happen towards the deadline, things move more quickly.
And so finally, you know, there was a big election in Chicago. Incumbent Democratic mayor lost. President Biden has been trying to keep the focus of the Democratic Party on being tough on crime, away from defund the police. Is it working, or do people still see big city mayors in cities that have a problem with crime as the face of the Democratic Party on this issue?
I mean, this is such a thorny issue for Biden. I mean, during the primary, he was accused of being too hard on crime, and then had to sort of flip in terms of, you know, we're not supporting defund the police when it came to the general election. He obviously has to, you know, appeal to the Black Democrat voters that do form the backbone of that party, and so it's a very delicate line that he has to face. I think him saying that he will support Republican efforts to block this DC criminal reform bill. I think that's sort of one posture that helps with this idea of perception and things like that. He also sort of has, again, to deal with these other elections. I mean, we spoke about the Chicago Mayor, Lori Lightfoot, who has been ousted after a first term. The people that are the top candidates now, one is a centrist Democrat who has supported, you know, an extra 2,000 police in Chicago, and the other is a former Black activist and educator who sort of wants to see social workers replaced with police officers. So I think having that debate at the forefront of political conversations is not going to be helpful for Democrats. But as we saw in places like New York City and San Francisco, more centrist Democrats are winning on this issue. So I think we're just going to have to wait and see. But obviously, if Democrats are talking about it, it's not a very good thing for them. Right.
So if there are some police defunders out there, the Democrats don't want to cop to it.
Exactly.
All right. Thank you, Naomi. You can read Naomi and the rest of our political team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.